Hello, welcome to Rip Rap and another episode of our program on academic books. Today we're talking with Rafia Zafar, who wrote the book We Wear the Mask, and it's a book discussing African Americans writing American literature from 1760 to 1870. Rafia, the thing that fascinated me right away about this book is you were talking about We Wear the Mask, and how did you arrive at that? What was your idea?
Well, We Wear the Mask is a poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was one of the best-known early African-American poets, early African-American in the sense of being pre-20th century. But that's a poem that was well known to African-Americans well before the 1960s or 1970s. Many of the historically black segregated schools were named after Dunbar, the most famous being Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. And Dunbar's works were committed to memory by generations of African-American school children in the late 19th and 20th century. So We Wear the Mask, which is anthologized everywhere, including in the commanding Norton anthology of literature. I can read all three stanzas, but it has a lot to do with the book. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but, O great Christ, our cries to Thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but, oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. That's a poem African-American students today still feel quite a bit of empathy with, the notion that one has to dissemble constantly. It's a notion that is very powerful in the academic community right now in this discourse of American and African-American studies, going to Du Bois's notion of the double consciousness from his book, The Souls of Black Folk, published probably within about a decade after this poem. But it speaks to the divided consciousness, the masking, the constant dissembling that any American of African descent would have to undertake or undergo in order to operate successfully in a white dominated world. So that's why that poem is important for all African-American writers, because it speaks to the divided nature and to the constant need for dissembling, for masking, for veiling their true identity or intentions.
There was another poem you mentioned too, the H. Cullen.
County Cullen's
Yeah.
To Make a Poet Black, which also, you see, I have the mark of the professor. Everything is posted in these days instead of dog-eared. County Cullen is another. Actually, County Cullen went to the same high school as my father in New York City, DeWitt Clinton. And I can sing the DeWitt Clinton song, but I'll spare you. But this is another poem that speaks to that notion of I used to think when I was a little girl of being a unicorn, someone who was out of place. But I guess it was a good construction that I put on it, something rare and mysterious and ineffable and not known in the everyday world. So that was sort of my construction of being who I was growing up. Yet do I marvel, this was published 30 years after We Wear the Mask in 1925. I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, kind, and did he stoop to quibble, could tell why the little buried mole continues blind. Why flesh that mirrors him must someday die, make plain the reason tortured Tantalus is baited by the fickle fruit, declare if merely brute caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair. Inscrutable his ways are, and immune to catechism by a mind too strewn with petty cares to slightly understand what awful brain compels his awful hand. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing.
So how did this mask concept play into the area you're studying, which is what pre-Civil War or just after the Civil War to a period that parallels with the American Revolution, which is pretty early.
Yeah, well, I got interested in it when I was working on my dissertation, or actually even doing pre-dissertation work in graduate school, because then I wanted to write on the Harlem Renaissance, which is a very exciting period. Countee Cullen was writing during the Harlem Renaissance. It's a period roughly right after the First World War to the early 1930s, with a lot of ferment, activity, music and arts and literature, all sort of bubbling up, largely located in Harlem, this sort of Negro Renaissance, but there were pockets of it elsewhere in the cities where there were congregations of large numbers of African Americans who were educated and literate. But We Wear the Mask is concerned with that earlier generation, because when thinking about that period, I began to realize that at some point African Americans didn't think of themselves as such, so that African American literature had to wait, as it were, to begin until African Americans thought of themselves as such. And so African American literary consciousness would post-date the conception of oneself as an African American. In the 18th century and into the 19th century, African Americans, or what we now think of African Americans, people who were born or brought to the United States who were of African descent, thought of themselves or identified themselves as Africans, sable patriots in the phrasing of a Phyllis Wheatley, ebony. They didn't necessarily think of themselves as African Americans. Though they were, in fact, an early allocution was Anglo-Africans, which spoke to that, again, the collision, as it were, between the Anglo culture of the dominant group in the United States and the people who were kidnapped and brought to either the U.S. directly or from the Caribbean. I mean, that was another route through. So I thought that there had to be some path that people took in constructing this identity for themselves, this sort of literary, conscious identity of themselves as people of African descent who were writing as Americans in this period. And then later on, there was a notion of someone who was African American that came. And I tie that in the end of the book with changes that occur after the Civil War. So that in many ways, that's what the subtitle is, African Americans Write American Literature, that the sense of it was that folks of black ancestry weren't necessarily writing as African Americans and African American literature because of the audience, the mixed audience. They weren't necessarily just writing for African Americans, they were writing for a different purpose, not necessarily, and certainly not only for an aesthetic purpose, in ways that someone who had the luxury of coming from the dominant culture could write purely for an aesthetic purpose, or rather a desire to write purely for aesthetic purposes, because we know that those are problematic too, saying, well, this is only for aesthetic purposes.
Well, in your book you mentioned that much of it was for racial justice.
Mm-hmm.
As an element, and what motivation for why they were writing and how they were writing.
Well, J. Saunders Redding, in paraphrasing, I don't have the book to hand, I think it's at my office, but J. Saunders Redding in the 1930s, it's an early full-length work of African American literary criticism, said that it was a literature of necessity in some ways, that all early African American literature, or even African American literature up through the 1920s and 30s, has as one of its primary agendas the advancing of a political agenda. That African American literature was a literature of people who were crying, to refer to another novel, that I Am, The Man Who Cried I Am by John Williams. That was what the preponderance of African American autobiography, not just in the 18th and 19th century, but well into and continuing into the 20th century. That's why a first-person narrative, I think, is so important and integral to understanding African American literature, because one is trying to write oneself not only into acceptance by the mainstream, but even before one can and be accepted. If you were coming from into a society that said you weren't a human being, one of the first arguments you had to make as a writer was to emphasize your humanity, your belonging to the human species, as it were. And so that's an agenda that's subtle or not, depending on who the writers are. Some writers address it pretty directly. Some writers, like Wheatley, in some ways more covertly addressed.
Wheatley was one of the first writers to emerge, wasn't it, in your book?
Wheatley is the first African American to publish a book in her lifetime. First book of African American letters. Was not published first in the United States, or what became the United States. It was published in 1773 in England, which may speak to the sort of the contingent position of an African American or a person of African descent writing in what became the United States in the pre-revolutionary or in the revolutionary era. England was more overtly abolitionist at that point, which is not to say that there weren't abolitionist movements or people in the United States, or what would become the United States in the late colonial period. But her book of poems was not published in the United States until after her death. She died in 1783. She was probably about 30 years old when she died. There's no way of dating it for sure, because she was kidnapped and brought over to the United States on a boat called the Phyllis, which is how she got her first name, and she was bought by a family whose last name was Wheatley, and hence her name, Phyllis Wheatley. But she was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and they know that because she had lost her front teeth. So that's the only way people had any idea of how old she could have been. And of course she wasn't an English speaker when she arrived. But within a very few years, in fact by her early teens, she was publishing poems in newspapers in English. She was quite a remarkable young woman. I think these days we would call her a genius, because when you consider the trauma that she underwent. She's also known to be asthmatic. This is something that was noted about her. She was a frail child. Said that her owner, the mistress, Mrs. Wheatley, took pity on her, that they'd gone to the slave auction to buy someone to work around the house, and instead she saw this little girl who was shivering and wrapped in a piece of an old rag or carpet, and brought her home instead. And she was given, when they realized how intelligent she was given sort of light duties, and if she had a poem coming on, she could stop her dusting or whatever she was assigned to do and take up pen and write out a poem. She wrote poems that are lost. She actually wrote two full-length manuscripts that we know of. Only one has come down to us because the second was lost. Her husband advertised for it after her death. It had been loaned to someone, but it hasn't been recovered. Richard Newman, who's a bibliographer who was at Harvard, has said that he's convinced that it's going to turn up someday. But it's been a while.
One of the things that was fascinating to me was this whole population that you're talking about in this era.
People who are writing and creative and certainly aren't, in the mainstream of discourse about, So I thought that was marvelous that you had this whole population of people, and you also kind of balanced out, men and women as far as the ones you looked at, even though I know you mentioned that there's the stories of some of the men have been more brought out than the women, but still, that's quite interesting.
Rates of literacy would vary widely between male and female, and that would be within the white population as well, and regionally. I mean, the literacy rates would be much higher for males and females alike. In New England, they drop in other areas in the South. I mean, one of the great benefits of Reconstruction, for example, was the bringing into being of a public school system. And that's something that we can thank the Civil War for, and the fight for liberating the slaves was bringing public education to the South. That's something Du Bois brings out, for example, in Black Reconstruction, his history of that period, which was published in the 1930s, but that's often overlooked in the battle for black freedom that brought about all these other positive changes in U.S. society. But literacy rates are problematic to assess among African Americans because it was either legally or socially either against the law, I mean de facto or de jure, to read, to be literate, which is a problem when you're a Protestant. I mean, it's a problem for any number of reasons, but when people are converted to the Protestant faith, it's in part because every individual is supposed to be able to read and interpret the scriptures for her himself. And there were many difficulties with Christianizing the African American population. I think we were talking yesterday about Phyllis Wheatley. But the difficulties that black women have would be even greater than, say, white women, because blacks as a group were much less privileged than white women. And so it's a sort of the totem pole or the ladder effect, where white males would have the greatest access to literacy than white women. Black men, black women would be on the bottom because of the way labor was divided and what black women were generally assigned to do. So Phyllis Wheatley was kind of remarkable. There were other black poets publishing around the same time, but for a variety of reasons, Wheatley happened to get a book out in the 18th century. Certainly there were other literate blacks, male and female. Jupiter Hammond, for one, was another poet, a religious poet, writing about the same time. He even wrote a poem addressed to Phyllis Wheatley. So there was even when people may have been relatively isolated, Wheatley did not grow up on a plantation. She grew up as a slave among perhaps 2 or 3 in the Wheatley household. She probably knew of other slaves or free blacks in New England, but she didn't have a large black community that would be brought into being by this, the sort of the perhaps a silver lining of something as abysmal as gang plantation labor, is that at least you had, if you were a slave, a large number of other people of African descent nearby to have bonds with, family bonds, friendship bonds, which wouldn't be possible if you were a slave growing up in a relatively isolated situation. Boston, or even someone like Sojourner Truth, was growing up in upstate New York in a Dutch-speaking family. So there were all these varieties of black experience. That's also part of the problem that I've seen with looking at early African American literature. Again, and this is one of the reasons that made me think that I have to work on this for a while before I move back into the 20th century, is that many people have difficulty putting writing by black writers before 1870 within the context of 20th century African American literature. But the agendas were very different, though their similarities are certainly obvious. But there are also differences in just the genres that are popular and the availability of the writers to get their works into print. There was a lot of stuff that was circulated that is not available, still not available, and there are people who are working on it, like the Black Periodicals Project, stuff that's bringing these works that were published in ephemeral documents like newspapers and magazines, church bulletins. A lot of poems and short stories were published by African Americans in the 19th century, and we still don't have ready access to them. The Schomburg Library of black women in the 19th century has collected a fair number of works that many of which haven't been in print since they originally came out. Sometimes over 100 years. And some of those works I was able to use in writing the book. It's nice to be able to have something on hand.
One of the points you made I thought was interesting is about the issue of language. That you've got people coming from Africa, and of course they don't speak English, but one of the values of learning English was to be able to speak to other black people.
Yeah. I'm not an Africanist in terms of literary studies, but there I think is a difference in someone who is conversant in his or her own native language, has other people with whom he or she can converse in that language, can publish or write in that language if that's an option, or if that person wants that to be an option. In America, people were brought over by force, and frequently, deliberately, in fact, it was a policy to break up people from the same language group. So if there was a group of people brought over who spoke Bambara or Mende or any of the languages, they were broken up because there were fears of insurrection. If people could communicate with each other, then they could plan, they could plot, and possibly overthrow the head of a plantation or create all kinds of problems. just in terms of work or in something in the larger slave insurrections. The slave insurrections would be less likely, it was believed, or slaves would be less fractious and more docile if they felt more isolated, if they felt that they were unable to communicate with each other. That's why English became rapidly not only a means of communicating with the master, it was a lingua franca for also people from different language groups. There would be some shared language. There's some, in neighboring languages like French or Italian, there are similar words, and people from neighboring language groups. But English then rapidly became the language of African Americans. I mean, African Americans, we have to remind our students, it's not as though they're from Africa, that we came directly from Africa. Africa is an enormous continent with hundreds of different languages and ethnic groups. I did picture research for both of my books. It was easy for the first one because this was an edition of my great-great-grandfather's autobiography, who was a fugitive slave who, after the Civil War, returned to the South, found his wife, his first wife, and his youngest child. And because he found them, I am here. He was elected to the Virginia Constitutional Convention and served a term as a state senator. That was an easy piece of picture research because that picture is in the Library of Congress, which is where his autobiography has been sitting for decades in the Carter Woodson paper. And when I was growing up, I had always heard of the Timos. And when my sister and I would misbehave, my grandmother, his great-grandchild, would say, now remember, girls, you're not anyone. You're the Virginia Timos. And we had this great past. But my grandmother didn't know that much of him. He had died before she was born.
So he would be among those expressing themselves.
Yes, and this is his autobiography. This is a very rare thing, a full-length autobiography written by one of the actors, the black actors of Reconstruction. So he became a member of the State Constitutional Convention to rewrite the post-slavery convention of the Constitution of the state of Virginia, and was elected to the state Senate.
It's fascinating how he learned the alphabet.
Oh yeah, that's great. He pretended, again, I mentioned that earlier, it was against the law for slaves to read, either de facto or de jure, either because public opinion was against it, or there were actually laws on the books in many areas that prevented not only blacks from learning to read, but would put people in jail, black or white, for teaching black folks to read.
He made up a music scale with all the letters.
Because slaves, of course, were supposed to be entertaining. So he pretended that he was going to be a great guitar player and posted the letters of the alphabet on the musical staff, and would just so faithfully practice his guitar all the while learning how to read.
Whose poem is this, The God Made Man, Man Made the Slave?
That's Timos.
Why don't you read some of that?
Oh.
The first part there.
And that's where the title of the book, God Made Man, Man Made the Slave.
Now he wrote that?
Fresh from slavery, with its effluvium resting upon me, such a tender was only entertained on my knowledge of their ignorance of my ever having been in that condition, the condition of slavery. God made man, man made the slave. The last degrades him to his grave. I viewed before and cast behind. A glance betrayed the German mind. When finding I was of their craft, in staggering accents, how they laughed. But when detailing of my land, they wept and gave the pitying hand. A stranger, far from clan and kin, they vowed their will to take me in.